Mira, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to come to Spain and an honor to be invited to speak. Thank you to FAES also for creating the possibility to be here. The topic is rather broad and timely, I would say, because what we call the promise of Thessaloniki from June 2003, when the European Council opened the road to membership for the Western Balkan countries, has been maintained. No decision at the level of the European Council or Commission has gone counter to that. So the road to enlargement has been going on since more than 15 years. And for those of you who remember, Romano Prodi was then the chair, and he said the Western Balkans will become members of the European Union without ifs and buts, provided, of course, that they meet the necessary Copenhagen criteria, to put it simply. But let me take a step back and just recall things that we all know, but I think we need the kind of historical depth and historical perspective to remind ourselves of things that are obvious to some of us but have been taken for granted because the European project has now thankfully been living for more than 6 decades. And because we're here, I'd like to say how important it was for what, I'm a political scientist by background and a political theorist, what were the dictatorships of Southern Europe in Portugal, Spain, and Greece under the colonels, to have had the possibility to then be enlarged to become members of the then European Union. Of course, things were as difficult then. One would say today, from the perspective of the Western Balkans, that it was easier, but that's really a secondary issue. The key thing was that Europe was and remains a peace project after World War II, where European countries, and the main ones, of course, Germany and France, put their fingers to their head and said to themselves, do we really need to kill each other every 20, 30 years? For the past 200 years, is there another way in which we can settle our differences in a peaceful way? And of course, the various founding fathers, because they were all men, the Schumanns and the Monets and the Altiero Spinellis, came up with this idea, and the coal and steel community came about. So this project has been a work in progress since that moment, and then bringing in the countries, the former dictatorships of Southern Europe. And then also, as you know, when I taught in England for 3 years, and I remember the complaints about why did we bring in Greece in 1981. You know, you hear these complaints constantly, and the one that you hear even more often is, why did we bring in Bulgaria and Romania in 2007? Well, the reason we brought, I say we as a European, even though I'm not a citizen of the European Union, I'm from Serbia, from Belgrade, is that Europe was thinking geopolitically. Just imagine today the European Union without Romania and Bulgaria, with an assertive Russia that invaded Georgia in 2008 and invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed the sovereign territory of a European country called Romania, the peninsula of Crimea. So I think there was foresight and strategic thinking at that time, that regardless of the fact, and it's clear these countries were not fully ready in terms of democratic institutions, in terms of independence of the judiciary, of rule of law, but there was a kind of vision, let's bring them in, and then we will see to it with various control mechanisms, oversight mechanisms, that they advance. Have they advanced? Of course they've advanced, but not with the speed that one would have wanted. But at least when you look at the map of Europe, one sees that Europe is, to use the words of President George Bush the first, Europe is whole, free, and at peace, with some holes. And one of the holes is the Western Balkans. Obviously, Switzerland and Norway, incomparable. And if I dare footnote this, many nationalists in my country say, well, why can't we be with Switzerland and Norway and stay outside and be neutral or whatever? Well, the difference is in the GDP per capita. You just have to look at that and know why Switzerland and Norway can decide to stay out, even though, if you look at their relations with the European Union, they are part of Schengen. Norway contributes enormous sums of money to the European Union and other ways. So there's a lot of kind of mythology and simplistic talk about these particular issues. We are today in a situation which is certainly different due to several things. One, and probably the key thing, is the economic and financial crisis of 2008. Up until that moment, in the countries of the Western Balkans, we had economic growth of 4, 5, 6, 7%, depending on the country. The economic crisis took all that down to 2%, 1.5%, 2.5%. Serbia will hopefully have this year maybe 4%. And that means that political leaders are strapped because they cannot put into the pockets of their citizens the money that is needed for a decent life. And so that's a backdrop, a socio-economic backdrop. I don't want to be too Marxist about this. I mean, not everything is determined by socio-economic reasons, but it is a significant underlying factor of the challenges that these countries have. And of course, not only these countries, because basically, if you look at it, we have not come out of that crisis fully. The global question is about economic growth. China, as we know, is pulling world growth, and there the machine is somewhat sputtering. And so that is something that these countries have to deal with. Secondly, that crisis has engendered a whole kind of sense of disillusionment and disappointment in citizens, exemplified principally by the vote in the Brexit referendum and by the victory of Donald Trump in the US. It's what the business world calls a VUCA world, a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And in that world, people who are living the technological revolutions, the benefits of having a smartphone and being able to do anything that you want with it, but at the same time knowing that jobs are massively being replaced by machines, by digitization, by artificial intelligence, etc. And so people who have jobs ask themselves, will I have one in the next 10 years? Those who don't have one ask themselves, will I ever have a job again? And in this world where the political class is divided from a citizenry that in large part feels disaffected and disillusioned, we have the rise of populists, right and left-wing populism, that are challenging the mainstream parties, which are losing altitude in every country. Just look at the European Union elections. And that, in turn, means that everyone is preoccupied with themselves, which is normal. The European Union, with its internal challenges with these disaffected citizens, Ursula von der Leyen, the nominated President of the European Commission, has been talking about the need for democratic legitimacy and bringing back the trust of the citizens. But she's also, as you heard, said that she will be a geopolitical president of the European Union. And these are the two aspects that I am highlighting here that are extremely important. The fact that the enlargement fatigue, as the jargon calls it, has been around for many years is not surprising, because And let me say just one thing about the term enlargement. When in Western Europe or old Europe, the term enlargement is used, many think about Turkey. And there is a significant difference between the enlargement to Turkey and the enlargement to the Western Balkans. Privately, over the years, in conversations in foreign ministries and chancelleries around Europe, not only I, but other people have heard, look, you in the Western Balkans are different, Turkey is different. When France introduced the clause on the referendum for any enlargement, they will tell you, we will come to deal with it when you are ready to join. But Turkey is a wholly different matter, and I won't address the issue of Turkey here at this moment. But the other thing is, of course, that given this economic situation and given the travails of what we call the transition to democracy, all our countries have had difficulties in actually implementing democratic reforms at the pace that, first of all, we, the citizens of these countries, want, and then the expectations of the normative agenda that Europe has put forward in seeing to it that the acquis communautaire and the Copenhagen criteria are fulfilled. And what we're talking about here is principally the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. Last February, as you know, the European Commission came out with what was called a new strategy for the Western Balkans, which many of us applauded because it gave for the first time a date, 2025, as a possible entry point for countries that were negotiating. As you know, it is Serbia and Montenegro that are negotiating. Montenegro is ahead of the pack, but it also said, in what was still then called Macedonia, today North Macedonia, that North Macedonia could reach these countries or overtake them if the reforms were being implemented in a full-fledged manner. So the fact that certain countries are ahead doesn't mean that others can't overtake them. And I think giving the date of 2025, there was, a huge Byzantine discussion about whether to give a date or not. I think it's important to give a date because, to use the metaphor of school or university, when you enter university, you know that if you pass all your exams in 4 years, you'll be, you'll have a diploma and you're ready to go into life. For these countries as well, if we do our homework, we know that in 2025 it will be possible to get membership, of course, following the prerequisite ratification processes in still 28 member states. So I think it was an incentive to do this. Given the pace of reform and what the actual strategy of the European Union said back in February 2018, which was both a great opening and kind of giving incentive to move forward, it was also very critical because it stated very clearly that all of these countries, without exception, were still subject to state capture and to high levels of corruption. And that meant that, you, aspiring member states, need to deal with these issues. And regardless of the fatigue, etc., what I call the engine room of enlargement continues. You have people in Brussels who wake up in the morning, come to their office at 9 o'clock and open a dossier called Montenegro or Serbia or North Macedonia and say, what have they done, what have they not done? Johannes Hahn, the commissioner for enlargement, the outgoing one, traveled to the region extensively. Federica Mogherini traveled extensively to the region when North Macedonia was about to vote on the Prespa agreement. Probably the main leaders of the world came to that country. Maybe they overdid it a bit, but it was convincing, and we saw how important it was for them that this historical deal between Greece and North Macedonia be reached, namely on the name issue and removing the Greek veto from North Macedonia, moving towards NATO and moving towards European Union, something that many of us pleaded for during a decade and found it quite disturbing that a European member state was blocking North Macedonia's path forward. So this document in February, which many people have forgotten by today, again was a demonstration that Europe wanted this to move forward. Berlin process in Germany. Germany is certainly the key country for the enlargement, and along with it France, especially after the victory of Emmanuel Macron. Germany introduced what was called the Berlin processes in 2014. Angela Merkel, the chancellor, realized that the enlargement process driven from Brussels was going too slowly and wanted to give new impetus to it, and introduced this dynamic, and there have been 5 summits, Berlin, Vienna, Paris, Trieste, London, and the last one was in July in Poznan in Poland. The idea was to ask these countries to come together with some infrastructure and energy project, common infrastructure and energy projects. Basically replicating the coal and steel model. Come with something concrete, hold hands together, come with a joint project. I'll just give one example. So Serbian presidents Vučić and Kosovo president Hashim Thaci came together with the project of a highway linking the second biggest city in Serbia, Niš, with Pristina. That was back in 2014. Yesterday, 2019, 5 years later, the European Investment Bank gave $100 million for the beginning of the building of that highway. Fantastic news. The European Commissioner for Transport, the Slovenian Violeta Bulc, came to Belgrade. They signed. Big news in our little region. The bad news is that it took 5 years to get from the initial idea of 2 presidents kind of replicating a coal and steel idea to the implementation. And here I come to the question of China and China's investments, and I'll come to Russia later. The reason that the European Union brought this strategy document to light in 2018 was because there was increased talk of what was diplomatically called the interference of third-party countries, very clearly speaking, the interference of Russia, China, the Gulf countries, and Turkey. Russia, more politically, in terms of influencing, trying to put sticks into the wheels of European and NATO enlargement in the region, trying to prove that Europe is weak. Russia continues to try and put sticks in the wheels, not only in our region, but throughout Europe. As you know, President Macron, when he met President Putin a year and a half ago, told him bluntly, what your television, RT and Sputnik are doing is not, what one would expect for countries that have good relations. So Sputnik is present in our whole region. They are financing political parties who are pro-Russian, and that game goes on. China, on the other hand, is investing into infrastructure projects in our region. Lots of questions about the terms of these loans, the interest rates. Will we become kind of interest rate dependent on China in the future? Leaving that to the side, and we can address it in the Q&A afterwards. The key thing is, that is why I mentioned this highway project, is that all of our countries need badly investment into infrastructure, because that's the way that you can then multiply the effect of that infrastructure on economic activity and growth. So to give you one example, in Belgrade we just had one bridge over the Danube. The Chinese came and said, you know, we're willing to finance the building of a second bridge, which they did, and they finished. My question is, why didn't Western companies or the European Investment Bank or the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, come and say, because you are here in Europe and because we want you to become part of the European family or geopolitical family, we will give you the credit. So, you know, you can wait until, you know, the chicken come to roost, you will not get it. That is why the EIB news is good, but, you know, in waiting, we countries are accepting Chinese loans for the building of highways and of bridges. Now, I need not remind you that, you know, when asked, so why are you accepting these Chinese loans? I said, wait a minute. When we look at other countries, Sweden has sold its prize car makers, Volvo and Saab, to the Chinese. Daimler-Benz in Germany last year gave 10% of ownership over Daimler-Benz for $10 billion to the Chinese. Britain was negotiating the building of a nuclear power plant financed by the Chinese. Greece sold its major seaport, Piraeus, to the Chinese. So, look, don't ask us. Tell us, you know, we can work these things out together. And of course, until you are not member states, you can accept these loans. So, to put it colloquially, we are caught between a rock and a hard place. All our countries need infrastructure development. With my wife, who is here, we traveled from the Montenegrin coast this summer, and we saw this beautiful highway that's being built from the capital Podgorica through mountains. This fantastic viaduct that is nearly 200 meters high, and you know, we will be able to travel to the coast from Belgrade instead of 10 hours for 5 hours. And so countries live and require these things. Now, you know, those of you who followed the Chinese Party Congress a year and a half ago know what Xi Jinping said in his concluding remarks. Basically, you know, if we were to translate it, that China basically wants to kind of come out as the country on top, to put it politely and mildly. The Financial Times had an article, I remember, a year and a half ago, you know, if the Chinese can't conquer us, they'll buy us. And Huawei and the 5G network, we see what kind of issues are related to there. I'm saying all this because, on the one hand, the enlargement to the Western Balkans is part of a credibility issue of the EU. If the EU cannot integrate a micro-region with micro-countries, we're talking about 18 million people, yes, 6 countries, but 18 million people. If it cannot do that, how is it going to address much bigger issues? And that entails, I would say, greater commitment and greater engagement. The United States has just appointed, again, a special envoy for the Western Balkans. Matthew Palmer, some of us know him. He served in the embassy in Belgrade, a great, knowledgeable American diplomat. The Americans have always been there. They rightly handed over the business of democratization and enlargement to the European Union, because this is Europe, and Europe has the key say in it. But, for example, in the Serbia-Kosovo talks, an American was always present. One of them was Phil Rieker, who is now the acting Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, who was also, by the way, ambassador to North Macedonia, and again, a friend of many of us. So I think that it is important to understand that there still needs to be, in the spirit of transatlantic cooperation, a helping hand from the United States in these issues, but that the EU must continue to be more committed, in a sense, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens with the new European Commission. Some of you had heard that the nominated Commissioner for Enlargement is the former Hungarian Minister of Justice, Laszlo Turcsin. Maybe we'll leave that for the Q&A. A country that has not the best record in the rule of law, rather it is one of the backsliders in Europe, and that's a challenge that the European Union has. You know, things that are unexpected and unfortunately always happen. First one is, you know, that a country would want to leave, like Britain, or that you would have member states who, after having advanced on democratic principles and institutions, starts backsliding on democracy and the rule of law, like Poland and Hungary. But having said that, at the same time, and we were just mentioning it with the Romanian colleague who's here, all of the countries in this part of Europe, I mean South Europe and Central Europe, are pro-enlargement. There is not one country that has been against, whether it's Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Austria that held the presidency, very pro-enlargement. Some of you who know your history well know that Chancellor Metternich said that the Balkans begins at the Rennweg, which is an avenue in Vienna. Italy, very pro-enlargement. You can tell me how spirits are here, but I believe Portugal and Spain also. We have countries in the north that are more skeptical about this. And in particular, President Macron has been very vociferous about enlargement and saying, you know, using the old adage, we need to deepen before we enlarge, before we widen. And this has been very disturbing for many of us, because the widening, if everything goes well, can happen at earliest in 2025. And probably with the ratification process 26, 27, 28. So we are anywhere between 7 and 9 years away from the next enlargement. What does that mean? That means that Europe has 8 to 9 years to deepen before enlarging. And I must say that we were all very disturbed when North Macedonia did not get the invitation at the June Council, after this historic deal in Prespa with Greece. Now, I think everyone in this room is aware of how difficult these historical compromises are. You know, Kashmir has been unresolved for 70 years. Cyprus for more than 45 years. We have a number of so-called frozen conflicts: Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. May I add that Slovenia and Croatia, 2 NATO EU member states, have still not resolved their border dispute. And so Serbia and Kosovo are also there. Now there's a new impetus on Serbia and Kosovo. There's a willingness, a political willingness. It needs 2 to tango, of course, and Kosovo is about to go into elections. So we'll see how that goes. But there's an understanding in Europe. And believe me, I worked in government briefly. I was the senior foreign policy advisor to Serbian Prime Minister Đinđić in 2002 and 2003. Every European leader that came said, we will not take in a new country that has unresolved territorial issues. We will not take in a new Cyprus. And that message has been hammered into us, as I said, since 2000, since the fall of Milosevic. And everyone understands that, and everyone who's anyone knows that Serbia must resolve this to become a member state. And that is why, by the way, North Macedonia knew that it had to resolve this issue with Greece to move forward, and North Macedonia is moving forward. These are the issues in a bit of an incongruent way described here within that broader framework. Final few remarks. The EU is not the only game in town anymore, but it is the most important game in town. Just look at the economic numbers. Incomparable contributions of European investments, of gifts, of the various funds coming from the European Union. They are around, ballpark figure, around 65 to 70% of all the money that we get in the region and in our countries. Russia and China are to the bottom. Just to give you one example, when Luxembourg was presiding the European Union a few years ago, there was a title in our newspaper saying, Luxembourg is the smallest country of Europe, but it still gives more than Russia gives to Serbia. And that is what, of course, politicians, whatever kinds of relations they have, know how dependent we are. Our countries cannot live without the European Union. Historically, culturally, of course, we belong to Europe. Something happened in Europe that should not have happened at the end of the 20th century, namely a war in a European country. Even though we were educated, like all other Europeans, that war must never happen, we read the same books, we were taken to the concentration camps to see, we saw the movies, and yet the dark times of Europe came back into a country called Yugoslavia that no longer exists today. That country is today 7 countries. I have a little reproduction of a European artist from the end of the 18th century, and on that etching it says, El sueño de la razón produce monstruos. It's Goya, of course, this famous etching. And at the time of the Enlightenment, I believe we still live in the age of the Enlightenment, no matter what the issues are. There has been a slumber, a sleep of reason, given what has happened. And I return to what I said. I think it's in part because people have forgotten how bad things can be, and they have taken for granted the peace that we have in Europe, the open borders that we have in Europe, the common currency that we have in Europe. And fortunately, Trump and Brexit jolted these people, and we have had a resurgence of support for the European Union, because I think people started putting fingers to their head and said, wait a minute, what would it be like if we started to unravel and build borders? And because I am also a political theorist, I end on the famous words of Machiavelli, where he distinguishes between fortuna and virtù. Fortuna is destiny. It is the wind of life and the world that carries us. But there's also virtù, our capacity to shape destiny. And if we don't use the capacity as human beings, as communities, as polities, as countries, to shape our future, then destiny will take us away into unwanted territory. Thank you very much.